Dave, just want to check and make sure you can hear us.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Okay, good morning, everyone. And Mrs. Best here, Mrs. Parent was unable to make it today. Today we're beginning our policy audit of the student series. So we are looking at revising board policies in the series 5000, 5100, 5110, 5125. I'm not going to read them all, but the documentation is there. 5130, 5150, 5160, 5215, and 5220. So why don't we start, Mrs. Sion? Do you want to walk us through them?
Sure. So the changes suggested for policy 5100 are just technical in nature and some stylistic changes that Shipman and Goodwin suggested.
Okay, were there any questions on 5100, physical restraint and seclusion of persons at risk? There was nothing material I saw there. It was mostly grammatical.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, no questions?
Nope.
So we'll bring that one forward. Policy 5110, school attendance districts.
Right. So school attendance districts, despite all of the legal citations below, it's not really a policy that the board needs, but most boards do have a policy that talks mainly about guiding principles in the case of redistricting. So the recommendation here is to look and see whether these are still the guiding principles of the board. Some of the other principles that schools use are, to relieve overcrowding, to achieve maximum permanency of districts, to maintain the safety of children who are either walking or riding the buses. So this is really a board decision. The policy committee should make recommendations, perhaps.
Okay, were there any thoughts on 5110?
I had one thought.
Mrs. Best.
Just to flag it, I suppose, the point that children at the same grade levels from the same neighborhoods should, to the degree possible, attend the same school. Obviously, that's a guideline. We can't always guarantee that, but I don't know if it's worth any discussion with the board at large, considering all of the new developments that are coming into town, et cetera, as we look at possibly fluctuating enrollment in future years.
Mrs. Best is trying to avoid the word redistricting. And, I think, we can, Mr. Brown, you can help us out, or Mrs. Sion with that should. I think that should gives us flexibility in doing that. It's a little nebulous as neighborhood is undefined. But I do think it gives us a little bit of wiggle room, and it has in the past as we've had to redistrict. But are there any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's some room. There's some play there. So I'm fine with it.
Okay, so what we will do is I will flag this for the board to make sure they review, knowing that it is a local policy. And we can be prepared to answer questions during their first read. Okay, 5125 students and Section 504 Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and Title II of the American Disabilities Act of 1990. Mrs. Sion.
These are also just technical in nature.
Yeah, were there any questions here? These looked.
I had one language question.
Sure.
Mental or psychological disorder, is that language that we still use today? It speaks in other places of disabilities, impairments, just mental. That is on page 22 of the packet. It is section 1. It's under definitions, under physical or mental impairment, just above Roman numeral 2.
I'll check to
Thank
make
you.
Yeah,
sure.
we check if that's language in the act, and if it's not, maybe we could check Mrs. Klein on the best language.
Mhm.
Mr. Brown, any questions on 5125?
Nope, all good.
Policy 5130, student attendance, truancy, chronic absenteeism.
So these changes reflect updates to the law, which require now districts to allow students to take 2 non-consecutive days each year as mental health days. The definitions of excused and unexcused absence have been revised, but we're still waiting for the State Department of Education to give us the final definitions. But Shipman and Goodwin added definitions that at least reflect the current statutory language, and it changes the age at which a student can withdraw from high school. These are all mandated by changes to the law.
So on those mental health days, do we track them? Do parents have to flag them as mental health days? Like, how do we? So a parent, when they call in and just says the reason they're out today is a mental health day, ideally.
Correct.
Okay. Otherwise, they would go down as an excused or unexcused as defined by, okay.
I had one quick question. Excused absence, is defined as having written documentation. Does that mean when a parent has called the attendance line, then a form is filled out? So there's documentation that way?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the documentation can be done by the school. It's not incumbent upon the parent. Okay. Policy 5140, continuity of attendance. The recommendation is to repeal this policy.
Right, so dual enrollment is now covered in policy 5130. We changed that a few years ago. It's also clear in the student handbooks that if somebody withdraws a student to attend a program, that teachers are not required to provide special work for that student. So there's really no need for this policy.
Okay, so the recommendation would be to repeal. It seems slightly redundant at this point. Is everyone okay with that recommendation to the board to repeal?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, policy 5150, admission of resident, non-resident, and exchange students.
So many of the changes to this policy reflect our current practice, and they've been our practice since I got here and before. But having it in the policy will help us because many times parents will say, well, where's the policy? So the things that don't reflect our current policy are that if somebody is discovered that they're not legally a resident of Darien and they've been not quite honest with us, it gives the superintendent the ability to either force the student to withdraw or charge tuition. So there are other DIRG A and non-DIRG A districts that do have this kind of policy. And it, I don't know whether it serves as a deterrent, but it's there in writing. It gives the superintendent some extra power. The other thing that we did here was to put a limit on the number of months that somebody can say, well, I bought a house and I'm doing construction. This is something that the board can decide, but we've had construction that's gone on for years, and Dr. Adley and I have been chasing, when it's actually going to be done. So maybe 3 months is the right number. That's the number that New Canaan and Westport have. But if you want to give somebody a little more leniency, or if Dr. Adley has some discretion, but the construction part is a problem. During the pandemic and with supply chain issues, it's gotten worse.
So my experience of this is that it allows, we try to be as flexible as well as we can, but as a superintendent, I have to oversee students who enter the school system, right? But I say very just pragmatically, you can't just open the doors to everybody, right? There's reasons we have local policies and processes in place. I will say we certainly, as we do with any policy, look at implementing that both technically and also very respectfully with people. But there are a couple of times where having a few clarifications around specific guidelines about contracts and when things are going to come online, home construction, so on and so forth, just would be helpful. Whether we execute it to the law or not, but just having it there would be helpful to the policy per se. The only other thing here is like grade 5, occasionally if a student was leaving and finishing out grade 5, that tends to come up, and I try to work with families where I can. Currently, it's working, I think, in spirit and technically okay. This is just something I think would help protect, maybe a strong word, but it's also the correct word. The board.
So I would say from my vantage point, I don't know that 3 months or 4 months is the right answer. Although I do know the district has at times been in conversations where it has been years. And our practice has been, where do you sleep at night? Right. So if you can't sleep in the house. I would be open if the board feels that, it's 3 versus 4, I don't know that I have the particular right answer, and or providing the superintendent some flexibility. But I do think that we need to at least have some guideline there. Additionally, I would say that the board has had a practice in the past few years of charging tuition. So it would, if we're found that a non-resident is in the schools, so it would be incumbent upon us to put that in policy at this point.
Retroactively, you mean, charging tuition.
Yes, yeah, and the board granted the superintendent that right a few years ago. So I would like to see that written in, because I do think that at some point, if usually by that point, multiple conversations have gone on, and if it's still discovered that at some point there needs to be.
Don't we have that in the last sentence of the paragraph, the conclusion, imposed for the current year or any past year in which child was enrolled?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I just like that it's now currently in policy.
Okay.
I think that it gives the superintendent a little bit more ability in these conversations to be very clear about the consequences. So I don't know how anyone feels about 3 months. I'd be fine with 3 months, trying that. Superintendent could come back to us and tell us if he needs flexibility around that. But at the moment, though, the model policies from Westport, New Canaan, they seem to think that's working for them and not imposing any undue burdens. So I'm comfortable with the draft language here.
I mean, I'm agnostic as to whether it's 3 or 4. I think the real heft here comes the ability to go retroactively. I think that's what gives, I think the 3 months is a nice target, keeps things reasonable. I'm sure, as Dr. Alley just mentioned, he has flexibility around that. As we mentioned, it's here in his sole discretion, but then the fact that he can go back and charge for a year or past years, which to me sounds like it at any time. I think that's really what gives this its impact. So I'm fine as it is.
Okay, so given that this is local language, we will recommend this to the board as such and let them review. Alrighty. Dismissal precautions, the recommendation is to repeal this. It really is administrative, but Mrs. Sion.
Right. It's administrative. It's a little bit different at every level. It's not always the direct prior approval of the principal. So it's better left to the student handbooks.
Yeah. Is everyone okay with the repeal of this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, 5210, rights and responsibilities of student government. The recommendation is also to repeal this. Mrs. Sion.
I mean, the board signals its, support for clubs through the budget, and, there's no way to enforce this policy. So it's a nice vision, I guess, that we have student government, but not a policy.
Thoughts?
I'm good.
I'm fine repealing. I mean, this seems like we don't dictate or mandate any other club.
Right.
And I think that we would certainly hear from students if for some reason they thought they couldn't have a student government, and we'd be open to that, but it doesn't need to be in policy.
Agreed.
Policy 5215, standards of conduct. Repeal this policy. Mrs. Sion.
So most of the standards of conduct in this policy are contained in other policies, such as, 5220, student discipline, and we'll get to the dress code policy at some point when we revise policies. The only thing that isn't covered, and that the board used to have a policy related to civility. Shipman and Goodwin question sometimes how we would enforce that, but New Canaan does have one. And if the board wanted to look at enacting a civility policy, that's the only thing that's not covered by other board policies.
Thoughts and questions?
I think it's an interesting discussion to have. I think we discuss civility in all of our schools, whether it's the norms at middle, it's the vision of the graduate, et cetera. I think it's addressed in a number of ways. I'm not certain how it would be enforced from a policy standpoint, but I support civility.
So some of the principals have said that in the past, they would say, here's our civility policy. If you don't control yourself, you'll be asked to leave the meeting or the building. So it was something for them to point to.
Ms. Hartman, I would agree with Mrs. Best. We have core values, mission, vision, vision of the graduate, portrait of the graduate. These are all the guiding documents that speak to these issues.
So I would throw out there, maybe I'm throwing a monkey wrench in this, that it'd be interesting to look at a model civility policy. I would say what I've often found is parents come to me with questions and they produce the standards of conduct policy with student discipline. And depending if it's dress code or something else, and they're slightly contradictory. So I'm fine repealing this policy. And I think it would be an interesting exercise to look at a civility policy as kind of an overall guideline, at least as a committee, and decide whether there's anything enforceable there or whether we're setting a certain standard. I don't know how I feel about, I'd have to see the model policies to really understand if I think it's something that's policy or it's more of an aspiration. But I definitely would repeal this because I think at times people bring standards of conduct and student discipline and they have asked me to reconcile both and I can't. So I would repeal this policy. And then if we want to engage in the exercise of looking at a civility policy, we could make a determination then. Everyone comfortable with that? So the recommendation.
I'd have to see it to know what to do moving forward. So if we want to do the work to put something together to see, that sounds great.
Okay, so the recommendation then would be to repeal 5215, and just to assure the board if there's any concern about the loss of any civility here, we're going to go through the exercise of looking at what that policy might look like, and then we'll make a recommendation of whether it's a worthwhile policy to have or not. Okay, 5220, student discipline, Mrs. Sion.
These changes are also because of changes to the law, which now require that students in possession of cannabis receive no harsher treatment than students in possession of alcohol. The definition of remote learning has been revised, and the student discipline policy has been clarified that it applies to students while they're on our transportation.
Any thoughts?
I had a couple kind of little things. Number 8. It's not on page 64.
Inappropriate.
Inappropriate displays of public affection. The subjectivity of the term inappropriate as determined by whom. I also wondered about number 14. I was just surprised that having matches or a lighter just in and of themselves were an infraction, so to speak. And then at the end of this policy, if I'm following correctly, it sounds like the board votes on an expulsion case, but
Which
does
number,
not-
sorry?
Sorry. let me
No,
see
it's
what-
okay.
This is a long one.
So in terms of expulsion, the board has delegated that to an expulsion hearing officer. We do that
Okay.
annually.
Okay.
So we retain the right to vote on expulsion hearings, but then we vote each year to send it to an expulsion hearing officer.
Okay.
So in practice, we don't do that. However,
So my question was for readmission, if a student is readmitted prior to the end of the term of their expulsion, does that officer or whomever we've delegated or the board ourselves have a say in that? Because it sounds like it's specifically at the jurisdiction of the superintendent.
yes, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is once we have delegated, that decision is binding, and therefore the hearing officer is the one who then follows through also on a decision of readmission.
Okay. I didn't see that part that someone else follows through on the decision of readmission. Maybe I missed it.
I think it's-
86.
Well, ultimately, I would also have to do, make sure that if a student was returning, that he or she has satisfied the conditions of the expulsion that was agreed upon by the hearing officer. If not, then it can't come back.
So I may have missed it, but it read to me just that the authority to make decisions on readmission has been delegated to the superintendent. It doesn't mention any other governing.
So when we delegate to the hearing officer, are we specific in that, like, because typically it's a binding decision? And the superintendent can decide if the metrics have been satisfied for readmission. However, if someone wants a change in that decision, they have to go back through the process of the hearing officer. So are we clear about that when we vote?
When who votes, Mrs. Duckman?
So when we vote to appoint the expulsion hearing officer.
Yes,
So typically, if we had the unfortunate situation where someone went before an expulsion hearing officer and there was a decision made for expulsion.
yes.
And someone wanted to challenge that, they would have to go back through the process with the hearing officer. They would not come to us. We would not.
No,
override that
no, you
decision.
can't override it.
Yeah.
Nor the,
To Mrs. Best's
Yeah.
point, are we clear on that process with the expulsion hearing officer?
oh, yes. Yes, we're clear about that.
So if someone came to us and said, no, the board has the right to re-do this, we're confident that we can say to them, we've appointed a hearing officer and this is the process by which they go through.
Yes, correct, yes.
Okay.
That is very clear, actually.
Okay. And maybe that's just good as we revise this to go through with the board members, so board members now. I mean, it's a rare occurrence, thankfully, but it is good for everyone to kind of know what responsibilities they've dealt with.
Really, after the Board of Education, even if the board were residing over an expulsion hearing instead of a hearing officer, there is no appeal to that. That's it.
Thank you.
And that brings us through 5220. Dave, did you have any questions on 5220?
All good, Tara.
Ms. Best, you had a couple of questions there. Do we want to address them or do you want to?
I'm gonna go do a little research before. I do
Well, I'll just
that.
say like
sorry, you
inappropriate,
have more.
inappropriate displays of public affection. I mean, these are all administrative interpretation, just sort of, there are things that we're just like, we're not going to delineate to it. There's just no end to it. So I'll just be honest about that in terms
Okay.
of, I don't say it cavalier, or casually, but you kind of know it when you see it to some degree, right?
Yep.
Supreme Court rulings. We
And,
know it when we see it.
and the fireworks ones, they're legitimate. You can't be having those things on school grounds.
Or the matches and the lighters specifically were your question. I
Yes.
think that's
Yeah, you can't.
probably included in the law, but I'll be sure.
Okay.
And does that include, I mean, I hate to say it in this day and age, vape cartridges? Is that,
Yeah. That's in there.
that is
Well,
a
so we
heating
have a-
implement?
Right, so our no smoking policy now specifically addresses vaping or the electronic, whatever.
The
there's a
electronic
definition in there,
device,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. it was all
Sorry,
laid
Julie,
out
did
in
you
there.
have other questions?
No,
on
that
this?
was all of them. Thank you.
I move forward. Okay, so thank you, everyone. We will bring these forward to the board for first read, and then we will take on the other half of the student series for our next meeting. Okay, if there's any questions in between, please reach out.
Is our next meeting date set as yet or not yet?
It is, if
Is it the
you'd
trickiest
like me
question
to
of the
announce
day?
it, it's in a month from now,
All right.
Mrs. Best.
I'm sure I have it on my
It is
calendar.
on the schedule.
Yes, I have it.
Is there any public comment? And while we look up the date so I can announce it, is there any public comment?
For participants via Zoom, please click the raised hand option. There are no raised hands.
I don't.
And just as a public service announcement, the next policy committee meeting will be May 20th. Thanks to Mrs. Sion's quick look at the calendar.